session at a later time. I welcome all of you and I thank you because this is a very important topic and it is one for which I feel very strongly as I look across for all of those that are attending. You know that I am passionate about planning. It doesn't matter what kind of planning it is, but this is one that is particularly important. And I thank you for just availing yourself. You are going to be in for a treat today because not only is this good, solid information, but our speaker is a delightful speaker to listen to. And I haven't seen you, Jeannie, in, do you think maybe 5, 6 years, maybe? A teenager the last time you were here, and so was I. That is the story that we are going with. So it is my joy to introduce to you my friend, Jeannie McGill, who is a profound expert on pre-planning, and I am just going to turn over the microphone, and Jeannie, I am going to ask you if you want to just tell us a little bit about you. That's great, and don't tell any stories about me when we were teenagers, okay? Fair enough. Would you join me in welcoming Jeannie McGill?
Okay, so I'm gonna, since I'm way up here, I'm gonna take my mask off. It helps a little bit to talk. So glad you're here today. So tell me, what prompted you to take the class today? Anything? Nothing else to do? Well, I'm so glad you did because I can guarantee you, you're going to learn some new things today. My background, again, I'm Jeannie McGill. This is my 27th year I've been doing this. See, we were teenagers. And I've had the privilege of working around death and dying. I am a certified pre-planning, I forgot my title, certified senior advisor. And boy, was that ever the best class I've ever taken. We actually study seniors. I figured someday I was going to get to be one, so I might as well learn as much as I can. And it has been the most interesting ongoing CEU study. And what I realized through that is we as seniors don't really understand processes, things that take place in a timely manner. So we're going to talk a lot today about processes and things that you need to know. But what my privilege has been is to raise my family in working around death. I have 3 wonderful children. I have 5 grandkids here and 1 in heaven. And it has affected the way I have lived my life. Because you see everything. I'm also a trained hospice volunteer, so I have the privilege of taking care of serving a family when someone is dying, and what a privilege that is. Here, you know nothing about them, and you have an opportunity to hear their life story. But you see everything. You see the precious, the wonderful, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And my motivational gifts are I am an educator. So what I see, I teach. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, nobody talks about because either they don't know how or it's too difficult sometimes to talk, but there are life lessons that we can learn. And so please feel free to ask any questions as we go along. Excuse me, there's no such thing as a dumb question because believe me, I have asked them all. And we're going to kind of go through a series of things to help you understand. What makes me a little bit different is I did not go to college to be a funeral director. My brother-in-law, who is a pastor, he worked in funeral service when he was going to college. And he said, you know, with your communication skills, you might really like this. And so when I went to apply for funeral service, I still laugh at this 27 years later, I didn't do my homework. And I went in to meet with a funeral home owner in a bright red and white striped dress with dangly red earrings. And I sat down and I could tell the lady didn't like me. And I was thinking, boy, I wonder what I did wrong. And she says to me, what do you know about funeral service? And I said, well, I don't really know anything. I said, my dad died at 58, and so I've been through the funeral process. But I said, I couldn't tell you what a coffin goes for these days. And she sits up in her chair and she said, Frankenstein had coffins. We have caskets. And the thought that went through my mind is, lady, your underwear is way too tight. But what I realized is I hadn't done my homework. Funeral homes are very traditional, and you don't go into a funeral home to apply for a job dressed loudly. And so I learned, and I have been continually learning since then. What I did learn about color, though, that was really interesting, and the reason that I wear such brightly colored things when I speak is because color actually psychologically opens up community. And I can have a booth at the Alzheimer's convention, and there are thousands of people there. If I wear a particular color, the people that come out all of those doors to visit the different booths, they don't know why they come to my booth, and they don't even know what I'm talking about. They're just drawn to that. So I always tell the men, if you don't like the subject, enjoy the color. So I'm always looking for ways to paint pictures. The main sheet that we're going to use today is this sheet right here, called A Funeral is Not a Day in a Lifetime, but a Lifetime in a Day. And I'm always, again, as I was saying, looking for ways to tell people what they're going to experience, what it's like. And death is really a good teacher. What I have learned is that death is very final. You can't go back and say something you didn't say or do something that you didn't do. And there's a lot of psychological things that take place when someone that we love dies. We can go into shock sometimes, and we don't even know what shock is or what to do with it. It's just that we can't seem to function. And so as I would watch, when I worked in the funeral homes, when I would watch people come in day after day, week after week, with all of these 65 decisions that have to be made and never having had a conversation, the practical side of me said, hey, we've got to do something. We've got to fix this. We've got to start talking about death and get some education. And what I learned that was so interesting is that every one of us has a belief system about death. It's not a right or wrong belief system, but it operates in everything that we say and do. And who knows where we got it? It could come from church. It could come from experiences. Some people feel that if you talk about death, it's going to happen. So that's why we don't want to talk about it. The one I kind of get a kick out of is when people say to me, I can't be cremated because it's too hot, and I can't be buried because I'm claustrophobic. And I always think, well, it's a good thing we're dead, because we wouldn't enjoy either one of those. But let's talk about that a little bit more. And we tend to make decisions based on that belief system. When we came out with the new cremation, for those of you who don't know, we have two types of cremation now. We have fire and we have water, and we'll be talking about that. And when I started teaching on the water cremation, the first thing people said, oh, no, I don't want that. And being curious, I said, well, why not? Well, I don't like drowning. See, we associate that. And the biggest thing that I've seen lately is we think that we have got time to come back and tell our families where all our important papers are and what it is that we want. So that's why we keep putting it off and we don't do anything. And I've come to realize that once we get the dying part down, then we get on with living. Do any of you have, in fact, if I were to give you an envelope today that had the date and time that you are going to die, would anybody open it? Yes? No? Why not? Nobody wants to know? One man said in a seminar, well, yes, I would open it right away because if it's going to be soon, I've got a lot of explaining to do. But the truth is, none of us have any guarantees. I often think of the people on the 35W bridge that day. None of them, when they got up that morning, thought that they were going to die on that day. But if you did a study in a funeral home, a month's worth of families that come in because their loved one have died, none of them thought that they were going to die. I remember this one family so distinctly. The husband was like 45 years old, the picture of health. And he went out running one morning, and he didn't put any ID on him because he was the epitome of health. Well, he didn't come home that night. Family started to get worried. They started calling around, trying to figure out where he was, and nobody even considered the thought that he had died because he was so healthy. Come to find out, on his run, he had a massive heart attack, and he had been at the coroner's. So you just never know, and why not be prepared? It takes a little bit of energy and time to create a file, but once you get that file, you can say to your spouse or your children, if for some reason I don't wake up today or I don't come home, here's everything that you need, here's the phone number that you call, and here's the information that you need to give. If you ever want to give your spouse or your children the kindest gift, that would be pre-planning. All your kids or who's ever going to take care of your affairs, all they want to know is, what do you want? Don't make me agonize. Don't make me second guess. And for sure, don't put me in positions where I've got to make decisions where you and I have never had a conversation. And the world in which we live in today makes it even harder because you can go to the grocery store and get shot, or you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So you have all of that the family has to deal with on top of, well, did they want to be cremated or buried? We never had this conversation. So there are ways to have these conversations, and it starts with you being educated first. I get a kick out of all these women that say, I really want to do some pre-planning, but my husband, he just won't do it. I said, I said, are you a woman? Yes. Well, we women always get what we want. If you bring it up one way and he doesn't like it, then you bring it up another way. And if he doesn't like that, then you keep bringing it up. The process being that you have been educated yourself on what it was that you needed to know, and now you got to find out what it is that he wants, and you can do it in everyday conversations. Or blame me. Do you ever tell your kids when they were young, if you ever get into trouble, just blame your mother and say your mother told you couldn't do it? Well, blame me. Just say, I went to this seminar and I heard this lady speak and I'm going to be cremated. How about you? Not on your life. I want body burial and I'm having this or that. And this one woman wrote me specifically to tell me she'd been wanting for years to find out what her parents wanted. And that was all it took. She said, wow, that's what education does. So I want to read to you, as I mentioned, have always been looking for ways to paint pictures. And I found this on the internet. A young woman's mother had died, and I don't know what happened to her dad, but she said, I've never been through grief before. can or understand any of the processes. Can somebody help me? And this is what an elderly gentleman wrote to her, and it is the best I have ever heard. It says, as for grief, you'll find that it comes in waves. When the ship is first wrecked, you're drowning and there's wreckage all around you. Everything floating around you reminds you of the beauty and the magnificence of the ship that was and is no more. And all you can do is float. You find some piece of wreckage and you hang on for a while. Maybe it's a physical thing. Maybe it's a happy memory or a photograph. Maybe it's a person who is also floating. But for a while, all you can do is float and stay alive. In the beginning, the waves are 100 feet tall and they crash over you without mercy. They come 10 seconds apart and they don't even give you time to catch your breath. And all you can do is hang on and float. After a while, maybe months, maybe weeks, you'll find that the waves are still 100 feet tall, but they come further apart. And when they crash all over you and wipe you out. But in between, you can breathe, you can function. You never know what's going to trigger that grief. It could be a song, a picture, an intersection, the smell of a cup of coffee. It can be just about anything, and the waves will come crashing. But in between waves, there is life. Somewhere down the line, and it's different for everybody, you can find that the waves are only 80 feet tall or 50 feet. And while they come, they're further apart, and you can see them coming. Maybe it's an anniversary or Christmas. You see them coming, and for the most part, you prepare yourself. And when it crashes over you, you know that somehow you will again come out the other side, soaking wet, sputtering, still hanging on to some tiny piece of a wreckage, but you'll come out. Take it from an old guy, the waves never stop coming, and somehow you don't want them to, but you learn that you'll survive them. Now, isn't that just the best description? So it is in this mentality then that when somebody we love dies, that we have to start making decisions. This sheet right here is the best place for you to start with asking the right questions. It says a funeral is not a day in a lifetime, but a lifetime in a day. If you've never had a conversation about what you want, never put anything in place, and you die unexpectedly, your family or legal next of kin is going to have to go through all of these 65 decisions. Now, Minnesota law requires that something be done with the body before 72 hours. So that body either has to be embalmed or it has to be cremated. And so we're going to go through and kind of talk about what all these decisions are. Now, the first thing that's good to know is if you find somebody dead at home, what is the first thing? And everything we're going to talk about is Minnesota state, just for our state. Wisconsin laws are different. Iowa's laws are different. But in Minnesota, who is the first person that you call? 911. Okay? And who comes first in the state of Minnesota? The police come first. And it is considered a crime scene, so you're not to move a body or touch a body or do anything with that. So the police come, they'll section off the place where the person died, and then they call someone from the medical examiner's office or the coroner's office, unless you are enrolled in hospice, and then they will come out and they will assess the situation. Has there been any foul play here? Nope, just died of natural causes. So they will release the body and they'll say, okay, now you can call the funeral home. If the medical examiner has suspicions about how the person has died, and they order an autopsy, then the county will pay. If the family orders an autopsy, then the family pays. And autopsies are between $3,500 and $4,500. Okay? So then the coroner will say, okay, you're free to call the funeral home. Now, that's where it gets really confusing. So we're going to talk about on this sheet right here, there's a box that says these are the people that you need to notify, you know, the doctor, the coroner, the funeral director, the cemetery, and all of that. But first you got to figure out what do I want, and unfortunately, how am I going to pay for this? What is happening with funeral homes now is that when a person dies and you call the funeral home, then if it's not been prearranged and paid for, they'll ask you for the information where the body is at, and then they'll set up a time for you to come in for arrangements. And when you come in for arrangements, then they're going to, by law, take out their price sheet, and you're going to tell them what it is that you want. And then they're going to go through, and Minnesota law requires that we have to itemize every single item that you want to have. There's a price for picking up a body. There's a price for transporting a body. I remember I did a prearrangement for a woman, and she lived right behind the funeral home, and the cost to pick up the body was $640. And she said, that is highway robbery. Just tell them to bring the wheelbarrow. I said, no, funeral homes have to charge $640 whether they go 10 miles or 2 feet. So the Federal Trade Commission is the final police over all funeral homes, and they have rules and regulations that they have to answer to, okay? So how much a funeral costs depends on 3 things. Depends on what kind of funeral you want to have, it depends on which funeral home you go to, and when you pay for it. If we wait until the day somebody we love dies, you're always going to pay more. And the reason being is we are not equipped emotionally to handle 65 decisions in that shipwreck mentality. And that's where the overspending comes in. Well, if I'd have known you're going to die, I'd been nicer to you. Or if I'd known you were going to die, I would have spent more time with you. And now you died, and how do I feel? Guilty. So now I'm going to have to spend more to make up for that. I remember in a seminar, this one man piped up and he said, you know, those funeral homes, they really are a bunch of crooks. I said, really? And he said, yeah, you know, they never put the cheapest stuff up front, and, you know, they're just playing on your emotions, and they just take advantage of you. And I was feeling a little feisty that day, and I said, oh, so now we're going to blame the funeral home because you don't do any planning. And it got really quiet in there. And I said, you know, the state of Minnesota says you and I are responsible for our bodies while we live in them, and then when we die, you know, so we need to make those plans and take responsibility for the bodies. And you know what he said to me? And there's probably 50 people in that class. He said, well, I kind of liked you in the beginning, but I don't anymore. I said, well, that's okay. I'm not here for a popularity contest, but I am going to tell you the truth, you know, is that we're just not equipped to handle all of those decisions. And so as we're working through these processes then, that's why I call it the deer in the headlight look. You know, many families come in, they have no idea how much things cost, and they really don't know what it is that they want, and the funeral director just goes through and tallies it all up and hands them the bill, and they fall off their chair. Well, I had no idea that funerals were this expensive. Do you think funerals are expensive? Now, you can be honest with me. I like a good discussion. What makes them expensive, do you think? Is it the cost of a casket? Is it the cost of a building? Well, it's interesting. Funeral homes do services that most people don't want to do. That's why they exist. They exist to perform a service at a time of need. Yes, there are a lot of things that you can do yourself when your mother dies. We have what I call new death laws that were just passed in the last 5 years. You can keep a dead, unembalmed body at home for up to 4 days on dry ice, and you can have a home funeral if you want to. You can transport a dead body in a approved container and take it to the funeral home yourself. One of the things that funeral directors really liked about me when I first started is I was so naive. And I'm a learner, and I'm taking notes. And this man comes into a funeral home and he says, my wife has just died and I'm shopping funeral homes and I want to know what your prices are. So the funeral director gave him an estimate of what the prices are. And as I was learning the processes myself, I said to the funeral director, well, how can he be shopping funeral homes because his wife has already died? And with a straight face, the funeral director said to me, well, here in Minnesota, because it's so cold, you can actually just put them in the back seat, and then you can go from funeral home to funeral home. And I went, I didn't know that. So I took out my notebook. News flash, you can keep it. And then he said, no, I'm kidding. He said the body was at the medical examiner's office. So that's why he could shop funeral homes, is because the body was in someplace different. So, but I can remember I brought many years of joy to them, because I remember when I saw an autopsy, and in my mind, I was thinking, because everything they take out and they put it in a bucket, and then they put it all back together. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, the heart goes here, the kidneys go here, trying to put it all back the way it was. And I said to the funeral director, what happens if you don't get it all back in the right place? And he says, we don't even do that. I said, oh, okay then. There's so many things to learn and to grow. So once you're in the funeral home, then payment is required on the day that you go in for service, for the prearrangement. So you either have to have a prepaid burial, you have to have a charge card, and or cash. And this is what really shocks people, because number one, they don't have any idea how much funerals are, and number two, they don't know that they're going to have to pay for it. Everything around death goes to legal next of kin. So, and this is what shocks people the most, there is a hierarchy for how things are paid. So it usually goes to parents first. If parents are deceased, then it goes to brothers and sisters and or nieces and nephews. And the coroner will find someone to pay for that funeral if they don't qualify for a county burial. And so if you have a single brother or sister that never married and never had any children, and he dies, it would go first to the parents. If the parents are deceased, then it's going to come to you as brothers and sisters to not only identify the body, but to pay for the funeral. And people say, oh no, I'm just not going to do that. Well, good luck with that. There's always 3 people that get paid in life: the IRS, funeral directors, and attorneys. Because if none of them did their job, we'd all be in trouble. If you have a single daughter or son that is divorced or never married and doesn't have any children or has minor children, it's going to go to you as the parent to not only, doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter if you have any money or not, but it's going to go to you then to have to identify that body and pay for it. So it can be very overwhelming. And the one statement that I have heard the most in the last 5 years from seniors themselves or for adult children is, why didn't somebody tell me? Why didn't somebody tell me that I was going to run into this, or that this was the process for how things took place? Well, the state turns around and says, well, it's your responsibility to understand and know what the laws are. But if you're a typical senior, good grief, it's hard to keep up with everything, because just when you get it down, what happens? They go and change the rules. So thank God we have people like Mari here that says education is important. I'm going to invite some speakers in so that we can all be educated. And I always tell people, once you've got your things put together, share it, because I would say 95% of the people that I meet with have absolutely nothing done. Years ago, if we didn't plan, we could get away with it. Now there are huge consequences, emotionally and financially, for not having the documents that we need. Any elder law attorney will tell you there's 4 things that every senior should have and every person should have in this day and age. 1, there's 2 that you need while you're living, and then 2 that are after death. One of them is a healthcare directive. The second is a durable power of attorney. The third is a healthcare directive. Did I say that already? And the third one is a will, and the fourth one is written funeral arrangements. If you have all of those things done and are updated, then you're good to go. That means that if something happens and your time comes, you're not going to leave a mess for somebody else. If you don't have a power of attorney and you get sick, your kids cannot call your doctor and find out what it is that you're taking, what your diagnosis is, because of HIPAA laws. And it's untold stress that puts on your children, because they can't give you the care that is needed. They don't have the authority. I had a woman who was taking care of her mother at home. The woman was in her 40s. The mom was young. She was like 62. And she noticed that her mom was getting a little forgetful and a little behavior changes. She's getting a little bit more aggressive. But did you know, in a short amount of time, a person can go from dementia to full Alzheimer's? And so she didn't know what to do with her, so she started calling around and saying, hey, what can I do with Mom? Can I get her into this place here? And guess what the facilities and people told her? I'm sorry, we can't talk to you. What do you mean you can't talk to me? You don't have any legal right to talk about your mother's finances or her health. You need a power of attorney in which to do that. And so what happens when the person that needs it can't give you that document because they don't have the capacity, then you have to go to court and become a guardian or a conservator. Nowadays, a guardian or conservator, minimum of $5,000 cost, plus the waiting time. Since COVID, the courts are backed up all over the place. That's why there's been so many changes and everything, because the courts haven't been able to keep up. So again, an important reason. So let's go back to, on this second box here, this is what the funeral director is going to tell you. This is what you're going to have to select. And again, it depends on what kind of funeral you want to have. Are you going to have cemetery property? What kind of funeral service do you want? Do you need a casket or an urn? Clothing, music, thank you announcements, time and place for the funeral. Are you going to have a visitation? Do you want memorial folders? Do you want it online? Do you want a video? Do you want an audio? Do you want memorial donations? I mean, are we overwhelmed yet? And where do we get the education that we need in order to make a good decision? We live in a society now where it's hurry up and get it over with. We don't want to be inconvenienced, and we certainly don't want to hurt for any length of time other than shortly. And so nobody teaches anymore the value of funerals. Do you know why we witnessed bodies and viewed bodies before funerals years ago? Does anybody know? Because psychologically, we needed to see that that person had died and that he was or she was no longer taking breath. And then we were able to come to grips with that and then go through the processes and be able to move on. Nowadays, and I think this quote is interesting, they say you can tell which way a society is headed by how they treat their dead. And we've had people say, I don't care what you do with mom. In fact, it's your job to get rid of mom. No, it is not. Again, everything is going to go to legal next of kin. And we think, well, funerals are no big deal. They're kind of even archaic, and we don't need to have them. And then do you know what happens 20 years down the line? Is people get stuck in life, and they can't figure out why they're stuck, and they go into counseling, and they trace it back to, tell me what happened when mom died. Nothing. We didn't even have any services. We didn't do anything. So again, we're not equipped to handle nothing at a time of death, and we think, oh, it's no big deal. But it is a big deal. I've studied under some of the best grief counselors in the Twin Cities, and if you want to study a fascinating study, just look into grief. It is so interesting. And we judge people because they grieve differently than we do. Well, you're supposed to be over this by now. It's been a year, and you haven't thrown any of Dad's clothes away yet. What's wrong with you? But you know what grief is? Grief is a broken heart. And everybody heals from a broken heart very differently. And the two things that every grief counselor will tell you that we need when somebody dies is, number one, we need closure. Now, closure can come in many different ways. It can come from viewing a body. It can come from being with a person while they're sick and going through the dying process. It can come from many different things, but in order to move on, we have got to figure out, I forgot to turn my phone off. We've got to figure out what that is. And then the second thing is, the second thing is we've got to have an ability to talk about what that person meant to us and how they affected our lives. That's how we are then able to move on. I hear a lot of people say that, with cremation being up to 75% that it is now, that they, and everybody's kind of doing it differently. Some people will have the body cremated, and then they'll have like an open house at a funeral home, just like what we did when kids graduated from high school. You had some food, and then you had an open house, and people came and went. And that might be convenient, but what happens then is the people who come go away empty. Well, we didn't even talk about Betty. There was her urn, but that could have been a decoration from the funeral home, and we wonder why our lives are empty. I'm not saying that we have to have expensive funerals, but they have to be meaningful in order for us to be whole and complete again, and go through the different processes. I was doing a pre-arrangement with an elderly couple. He was in his 90s, and the daughter was there, and the daughter was a typical baby boomer. I can say that because I am one. Take charge, make decisions, this is how we're going to do it. And he had just put her in a nursing home, and he was telling me how much he loved their church and how they'd been together for so many years, and he was going to be buried out at Fort Snelling. And so the daughter steps in and she says, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to have the burial at Fort Snelling first, and then we're going to have the service at the church, and then we'll have a luncheon, everything all on one day. Bada boom, we're done. And I looked at the husband and I said, how is it going to feel for you to have a service at the church and not have, they wanted body burial, and not have your wife's body there? And he says, oh, I don't want that. I want her body to be present, and we can be there together and then go to Fort Snelling. And the daughter says, oh, no, that's too time consuming, too confusing. We're not doing it that way. And so I'm sitting there thinking to myself, should I say it or should I not? And I thought, you know what? I'm going for it. So I turned to the daughter and I said, did you hear what your dad said? And she goes, yeah, but it's not efficient. And I said, well, how about let's be efficient at your funeral? I said, but this was really important to him if we're listening to what it is that, he wants and what would be important to him. And fortunately, she got it. And then she goes, I guess this has been all about me and not him, huh? And I said, yeah, but thankfully, we can still, nothing's written in stone here. We're still in the planning stages, so we need some education about what it is that we need when someone dies. You can have a family get together. You don't have to have a service at a church. Maybe have a picnic someplace. But if you just incorporate those two types of things, or even if you have an open house type service, just pick a time. Open house is from 3 to 5. Well, at 3:30, we're going to have a moment where we're going to talk about Grace and how she affected our lives and how meaningful that she was for us. That will bring closure to the people that you invite. Okay? So then we've got to provide an answer. The funeral home files the death certificate in the state of Minnesota. There's about 20 questions on there. They're going to want to know the mother's maiden name, father's name, date of birth, where you were born. If you don't have that written down ahead of time, kids don't know it, they don't remember it, and that holds up the death certificate. And so you can't do anything without a death certificate. Nowadays, it can take 4 to 6 weeks to get one. And another good tip for seniors, some seniors never go see a doctor because they don't feel like they need to. If you never see a doctor and you die, good luck at getting a death certificate because no doctor is going to sign off on a patient he's never seen. So at least once a year, go in and have a checkup. For nothing else, just to have them tell you look good. Because I've seen families not be able to get a death certificate because, which is a good thing, in that, they didn't need help, but it will take a lot longer to get a death certificate. So then arrangements must be made to pay for the following items immediately. This is what you're going to have to locate and prepare, in addition to answering the phone calls, getting the word out. And again, it's just unbelievable. You're not thinking clearly, no, I just saw him, I just talked to him. Or it's the shoulda, coulda, woulda. I should have gone over there yesterday, but I didn't. Or I should have done this. I mean, we're all human enough to respond in that way. And but then the funeral director is going to say, okay, the total of this funeral has come to $16,000. How would you like to pay for that today? I remember the first time I said that to a woman, she looked at me and she said, with money. Here I was being so bold that I asked her, and she goes, with money. I thought, okay then. But that's what is going to be required. And if you don't, funeral homes are not benevolent societies. They are businesses. And if you don't have the money to pay for the funeral, and every funeral home does it different, then they will turn it over to collections. And so eventually they will get paid. I've actually seen cemeteries are even worse than funeral homes. If you want to have body burial, at most cemeteries now, the opening and closing to dig the grave is just under $2,000. If you don't have that $2,000, guess what? You don't get buried. And I've seen people over the years, because they had no idea on how much funerals are going to be, have to pass around a hat and say, we'd really like to get mom buried here, but we didn't know it was $2,000. So again, finding out how much a funeral is going to be. We tend to make decisions on wrong information. It took me 15 years. My in-laws just died. They were 96 and 94, still lived in their own home. He was a veteran, And I tried for 15 years to get them to do prepaid burials. And do you know why they wouldn't do it? Is because my father-in-law had 2 VA policies of $10,000, and that's what he was going to use to pay for the funerals. Well, their funerals were $12,000 apiece. And so his philosophy, which I don't recommend this, but he always told his kids, I cleaned up your messes when you were young, and now you're going to clean up mine. Didn't go over well with me. So one day, I was a little upset because his brother and sister were just giving my husband, as the oldest, and a lot of grief. And so I went to the dad and I said, you know what? I didn't make any messes for you when I was young. And unless you get your affairs in order, my husband's probably going to have a heart attack just because of the stress level that the rest of your family is going to put him through. Can you please help us? And he says, well, just use those $10,000 policies. And I said, you know what? You're not going to get the money from those policies until 2 months after you die. So we're going to have to rearrange our finances in order to pay for the $12,000 just because you're being stubborn. And do you know it was exactly 2 months to the day that we got the money from the VA? So he was basing all that on incorrect information. I didn't know that. I didn't know that's what the process and understanding was. And once he realized that, then he said, oh, by all means, let's go in and take care of this. So my question to you today is the information that you have correct and current? Or is there possibly some more that you could learn or know about that could make a huge difference that you can do? So let's talk about prices now. Because I don't work for any funeral home, I work with them. That allows me to talk about prices. And this is where it gets really interesting. Everybody's allowed to charge whatever it is that they want to, but by law, they have to have a price sheet. So I got an example of a price sheet, and I'm just going to send it around that you can look at it. Every funeral home has to have one, and they're required to show it to you before they ever talk about prices. The problem is you don't know how to read it, because you don't know what it is that you need and what it is that you don't need. Had a man call me today, and he said, how in the world do you as a consumer decide on all these cremation societies, where to go and what to do? I don't know how to make a decision. And I said, well, unfortunately, the funeral profession is not designed to teach. They're designed to fill a need at the time of service. So you're either going to have to figure this out on your own, or you can come to a person like myself who is an independent that knows all the prices and can tell you exactly what the difference is. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you what the general costs are. If you want body burial, we are up to 75% cremation now. But not everybody is a fan of cremation. There are some faiths that don't believe in cremation. And cremation has its own rules and laws, which we will talk to when we get to that. But let's talk about body burial first. The traditional body burials that we had years ago, where you pick up a body, it's embalmed, dressing, casketing, cosmetizing. We're not so much seeing visitations the night before anymore. Everything is all on the same day. Where you have a visitation, then the funeral service, and then go to the cemetery. With cemetery costs, you're looking at between $8,000 and $15,000 per person. Okay? That's a traditional body burial. If that is too much and you still don't believe in cremation, you could have an immediate burial where you could go directly to the cemetery, don't need to be embalmed. But you'll have to have a plot, a marker, and the opening and closing. Cemetery costs alone are going to run you about $3,500 to $4,000. But that's body burial. Now, let's talk about cremation. We have two types of cremation. We have fire and we have water. There's only two funeral homes that does the water cremation. One of them is Bradshaw's, which is in Stillwater. And then the Cremation Society just bought the machine, and they're in the process of getting that going. So with water cremation, it's a big tube, and the body is placed into the tube. It's filled with water and a chemical, and then there's kind of a swishing motion that evaporates the flesh, and then the bones go through the second process. Cremation is always a two-step process. In fire cremation, a retort, which is the industry name for the oven, the body goes into the retort, then the flesh is consumed, and then the ashes go through another process. So, and water cremation is a little bit more expensive than what the fire cremation is. Most funeral homes do not own their own crematory. They're very expensive to run. The Cremation Society owns theirs. Washburn-McGreevy owns theirs. But the rest of the funeral homes will send their bodies on this side of the river. They go to Lakewood Cemetery. Lakewood is a cemetery, but it's not a licensed funeral home. So in their bylaws, they can never be anything but a cemetery. So you can't just call up Lakewood and say, I want you to do my cremation. You have to go through a funeral home. Over in St. Paul, I think it's Resurrection Cemetery that does most of theirs. When you go into a funeral home, they don't want to tell you what all the different prices are. They just want to sell you on coming to theirs. So they'll tell you, well, we have direct control over a body from the time we pick it up until it goes through the cremation process. That's why you need to come to us. Well, guess what? Nobody's losing bodies, so that's not the big selling point of what it used to be. So we have three types of services. One of them is what we call a traditional cremation, and that's the same thing as a traditional body burial. The body is picked up, it is embalmed, so the body is present for the service. You rent a casket rather than paying for one, and then you have the service, and then after the service, the body goes through the cremation process. Cremation is a 3-business-day process, okay? And that is going to, and then if you're going to the cemetery, then that would have to be like 3 days later. So, and that's going to run you between $6,000 and $7,000, depending on which funeral home you go to. The second, and by far the most popular, is what we call cremation with a memorial service or a celebration of life. And this is where people are falling into a couple categories. When I say cremation with the memorial service, people say to me, Jeannie, get with the program. It's not a memorial service, it's a celebration of life. Okay, I'll start saying cremation with a celebration of life. No, I want a memorial service. Well, it's the same thing, it's just how you're choosing to look at it. And what your faith says sometimes. Some faiths just call it a memorial service, some call it a celebration of life. But it's the same thing. So the body is cremated, and then there's some type of service. That's going to range in price anywhere from probably $3,500 to $6,000, depending on where you go. And then the last one is what we call a simple cremation. The body's picked up. Did you know that you have to have a permit to die? You have to file all the permits, and then the body goes through the cremation process, and family comes and picks up the ashes. That ranges in price from $850 to about $4,000 again. So what is the difference? Minneapolis, St. Paul, we have cemeteries, we have funeral homes, and we have cremation societies. How do you know where to go? Do funeral homes what's the difference between a cremation society and a funeral home? Do funeral homes do body burials? Yes. Do funeral homes do cremations? Yes. Do cremation societies do cremations? Yes. Do cremation societies do body burials? Yes. So what's the difference? Marketing. In the state of Minnesota, funeral homes and cremation societies by law have to be run by a licensed funeral director. Cremation societies exist to compete with funeral homes. And cremation societies, how they're going to make their money is in volume. They want to do a lot of simple cremations. If we can do 10,000 simple cremations at $850, then we're way further ahead than having to do all the work for all this other. And so everybody has kind of their own way of marketing and their own way of figuring out how they're going to make their money. What you pay for with funeral homes generally, their cremation prices are higher. And the reason being is they built their buildings the way they did because we used them for body burial for 3 days. You know, we had a visitation the night before, funeral service the next day. Nobody's hardly using funeral homes anymore, but they still have to pay for their buildings. It's a business expense. And they would love to charge what the cremation societies do, but they wouldn't be able to keep their doors open. So if you have a service at a church, you're not even using the funeral home other than to do the cremation process. So you could be paying up to $2,000 more by using a funeral home sometimes. But that's what nobody ever tells you. I always tell people, I don't care what kind of funeral you want to have. I don't care which funeral home you go to. My passion is in the education. I want you to get a good enough education that you can make a good decision. And I'm finding in today's world, people don't want to spend a lot on their funerals. They would rather have the extra money go to their kids, their church, their community, or something else. It doesn't mean that you have to have a cheap funeral. It just means that you've planned ahead and you've thought things through. If ever I've seen a need for planning, it is in today's world. And so what we do by planning ahead is we alleviate all those burdens of guilt. We keep it financially less, because I remember the one time a mother died and she had prepaid her cremation and she picked out this one urn, and her daughter had already picked out one that was like $800. And the funeral director said, well, this is what your mom had picked out, and this is the one that she wanted. Well, she'd automatically gone to the more expensive because there were things that she didn't do. And she says, well, I guess if that's what mom wanted. Again, that's the gift that you and I have to give, is we can just go through and write it all down. And your kids will never thank you because you'll have died. But the ones who put it together hear about that afterwards. Wow, that was the kindest thing. I myself have everything prepaid and pre-done, but I haven't died. But my mother had hers prearranged and paid for. She died at home. We kind of had a home funeral. The next day we go into the funeral home, and she had cremation with a memorial service. And the funeral director said, everything is paid for. What day would you like to have the service on? As an adult daughter, it was like, you know, my mom and I were very close. It was really painful for me when she died, but it was like this salve of kindness that my mother said, hey, even though I'm gone, I'm still taking care of you, which I've always done all your life. You know, so that's what it feels like, versus your kids not speaking to each other for years because, well, if you didn't have any money to pay for it, then they had to chip in. I'll tell you what happens. Let's say mom has died, you got 5 kids, no prearrangements done. They go into a funeral home and they have to select a casket. Immediately, one child walks in and says, that's it, that's the casket we're going to get. And one of them says, well, why do you get to decide? You always were mom's favorite. And then it actually goes back to childhood issues of what dynamics were within the family. And then I hear over the years, what happened to my sister? She always used to be so nice. And then mom died. And the thing that I think we don't understand is we don't know how we're going to respond when somebody we love dies until it happens. We think we know, but you can find yourself responding in all kinds of ways that you hadn't anticipated. Sometimes it's from the shock, it's from the sorrow, it's from many different things. But what a gift to be able to say, oh, this is all taken care of for you. And it's really a simple process. So did we talk about cremation with a memorial service, the price on that? Yeah, it's around $2,000 to $6,000, again, depending on which funeral home. So what we do is we create files. So by the time I'm done working with someone, say it's a couple, each couple has their own file. On the outside of the file is the name of the funeral home. And then you tell your kids, if for some reason we don't wake up today, here's our funeral files. This is all that you need to do is call this number. I go over to the funeral home that they've chosen, set up a file there so they have copies, and it's just one phone call then that sets everything in motion. So, questions then. I know what else I wanted to tell you about cremation. Cremation in many ways is much more flexible than what body burial is. But people don't think it all the way through. They think, well, just get the body cremated. And then I get calls from adult kids. I got mom and dad in the trunk of the car. I got them in the closet because nobody told me what to do with them. And I don't want to throw them away because that was mom or dad. I met a gal the other day. She had 6 cremated remains of family members in her closet at her house. And I said to her, you do realize, the older I get, I'm just real. I said to her, you do realize if you die unexpectedly, what's going to happen to those, don't you? And she says, no, what? I said, they're all going to go in the trash. Because most of the time, they're in boxes or some kind of containers. Nobody knows what's in them, and they're just going to pitch them. Is that okay with you? Well, no, I gotta figure out a place for them. Well, I said, then you need to get busy because you don't know how much time you have left, but she never even thought about that. So you have to think it all the way through. The other thing with cremation is it is a final disposition. What we mean by that is when a body is cremated, there is nothing, no DNA, nothing left that said you ever existed. And so you have to have legal authorization in order to be cremated. I have people fill out that legal authorization form ahead of time. If the medical examiner, who is the final police, somebody dies and they don't have a healthcare directive, they don't have any funeral arrangements done, the 2 questions that he asks are, did they ever say they wanted to be cremated? Do they have it in their healthcare directive, or did they ever sign a cremation authorization? So if you didn't sign it before you die, it's going to go to legal next of kin. So husband and wife, husband dies, wife is legal wife. She says, yes, it's okay for him to be cremated, he can be cremated. If she does no pre-planning and she drops dead and she has 5 adult children, she has to have the consent of the majority of those 5 adult children. If one of those children says, you know what, I don't believe in cremation, no funeral home is ever going to cremate you. You know the reason why? Is because people would sue funeral homes. And that did happen. A gentleman died, the children went into the funeral home, they lied to the funeral director, told them that the wife had died, and they had him cremated. Who walks into the funeral home a week later but the wife? And she said, you cremated my husband, and I did not give you legal permission in which to do that, and she sued him. So funeral homes are very strict about cremation authorization. Now, what to do with the ashes? You can bury the ashes in a cemetery. in a plot, in a columbarium, which is a nice wall like this that's divided up into little boxes. You can put the ashes in what's called an ossuary. Anybody ever heard of that before? An ossuary is one massive grave. And so for $100, you can go in this little box and it drops down and sprinkles the ashes underground with everybody else that's down there. That's the most economical. You can spread the ashes. However, there are certain restrictions. How the state of Minnesota looks at spreading of ashes is littering. And in some places, you can receive a fine. The boundary waters are the biggest. I think it's like $350 to a $500 fine if they catch you spreading them. The thing with spreading ashes is don't be an amateur and figure out how to do it. Do you remember Barbara Carlson, the radio talk lady? Her mother died, and her wish was that her ashes be thrown from the Anoka Bridge. So Barbara Carlson on national radio says, I'm standing on the Anoka Bridge here. We're going to have a few moments of silence while I throw my mother's ashes. Join with me. So you have this moment of silence, and then you hear this. And then she gets back on and she says, a little word of wisdom. If you're going to spread ashes, check and see which way the wind is blowing. I now have my mother up my nose, in my hair, down the front of my shirt. And you do have to be educated. If you, one of the elder law attorneys I work with, she shares the story about her in-laws were from Chicago. And she has two teenage girls. I think they were like 18 and 17. And we've spoken together numerous times, so she knows what the rules and the laws are. Well, her mother-in-law died unexpectedly, and they weren't open to listening to any words of advice or how to do things. And they decided that they were going to take the mother's ashes, go to the cemetery, and spread it over the top of her mother's ashes. So on Mother's Day, they called a special meeting in the cemetery for the family, and the attorney is just going, this isn't right, we can't be doing this, but I can't stop them. So they're all lined up at the graveside of the grandma. The dad, the husband, opens the box with the cremated remains and reaches in and gives each person a handful and says, now go ahead and spread it over the top. Well, there's dust and everything that's floating up, and everybody is coughing. And so she says, well, maybe we need some water. So they go get some water out of the car, and they're watering the top of the grave while they're putting these ashes or whatever in the box. They've never seen ashes before. And her two daughters are mortified because they look down and there was grandma's teeth. There was particles of bone that were there. And they just, when they got back in the car on the way home, they said to the attorney, tell us this wasn't normal. This isn't what usually happens, right? And the attorney said, no, I'm sorry, it isn't. This isn't how things are normally done. But that was a traumatic for them to witness that because they didn't follow the rules or understand, the consequences of what could happen. When you get cremated remains back, it's basically bone fragments. And you do have to look at them before you toss them or do whatever with them. And I will tell you, and you would not know this unless you worked in funeral service, so if you tell somebody, I may have to kill you. But don't ever put ashes in an urn and then throw the urn into the lake, because the urn will wash up on shore. Somebody's going to find it. They're going to take it to the police station, and then the police are going to take it over to the Minnesota Department of Health. They're going to open it up, and they're going to know that it was you that was in there, and they're going to look at your file, who the informant was that took care of your arrangements, and then they're going to call your son or daughter and say, would you please come and pick up your mother? We found her floating in the lake. And how they know that is because of the way that cremation is done. There is a disc the size of a quarter or the size of a dime. Everybody is cremated individually. We don't do mass numbers, and all cremations are done the same at every funeral home, okay? So that disc goes with you into the urn or into the cremated remains, or if you don't purchase an urn, it's just in a sack where the cremated remains are. And so if you're going to spread ashes, take that disc out. And people say, oh, there never was a disc. Yes, there was, you just didn't see it. Or I never signed a cremation authorization form. Yes, you did, you just didn't know that was what you were signing. So it's universal funeral service. Okay, questions then. What are you just dying to ask me? Anybody? Huh? No? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Well, remember, there's no such thing as a dumb question. Yes? Uh-huh.
So single people would say, they're 70 and they die out of state. Are they tracking it back to a sibling?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll tell you, I met with, I was at a woman's retreat, church retreat, and I was telling her about that, and she says, well, my husband has a brother that never married, never had any children. He's 59. I'm sure he's not going to die for a long time. I said, well, if I were you, I would start a file on him and start collecting some information, ask if he has a will, if he has anything done. So she called him and she asked him, and he said, yeah, I've kind of been working on something. Well, they decided they wanted to meet with me on a Friday to do their own funeral arrangements. Thursday night at 12 o'clock, the brother lived up in Seattle, Washington. They got a call from the medical examiner in the state of Washington telling him that they found the brother dead, and would they please come out. Now, this couple was 85 years old. Would they please come out and identify the body and take care of the funeral arrangements? So what the medical examiner does when they find a deceased person is they're going to go through all of the house, the belongings, the phone, to find some legal next of kin. I had another woman who she got a call 10 o'clock at night at the door. She opened it up, and there was a police officer there. Are you Sally Smith? Yes. Do you have a cousin named Nancy? Yes. Well, I regret to inform you that she has died. She is at the medical examiner, and we want you to come down and identify the body and pay for the funeral. And somehow this woman got my name, and she called me and she says, am I liable for this? I'm a senior. I'm on a limited budget. Why doesn't somebody tell you that you're going to get a phone call like this? And so I said to her, well, unfortunately, here's what's going to happen. Because she's at the medical examiner, any funeral home that you call, you're going to become what we call the informant, which is the person who makes final decisions and who is responsible for a funeral bill. Now, this gal was young who died. She was only 45. I said, the first place we can go is to the county. If she had no assets at all, we can apply for the county that maybe the county would pay. Otherwise, yes, at that time, the cheapest cremation was $750. And I said, but yes, otherwise you are going to be responsible. And so we checked into it. Nancy, who had died, lived in a mobile home, and that mobile home was in foreclosure, but it was still considered an asset, so the state wasn't going to pay for anything. So she says, how in the world? I believe that she was my family. I believe I want to step up and take responsibility for this, but I don't know how to do it. I don't have that kind of money. And so I just went out on a limb and I said to her, you know, whenever in life I have been asked to step up and do the right thing, that means that there's a way for it to be done. I just have to be creative enough to look for anything I can to find it. So I said, the solution is there, just look for it. So she thought, well, I'm going to go over to the mobile home and see if I can find anything. So she went over and she found some old gold coins and some chains or something, took it to the gold guys and melted it down. It was exactly $750. And that's how she paid for it. But what happened to that other couple is the brother who died had no will, had nothing, so it went to probate. So they had to spend their own money to go out, empty the house, the contents, try to put it up for sale, which you can't do on a timely basis when you have to go through probate. So they had to pay all the expenses out of their pocket, not even knowing if they were going to receive anything back. That's what I mean by the kinds of messes that we can get into. My challenge to a lot of young people today is a lot of young people are living together and combining their incomes without consequence of what happens to one of them. Minnesota does not look at common law marriages as being legal. I had a woman who, she came to one of my seminars. She was in her early 60s, and she lived with a man for, 43 years. They had combined their incomes. He owned the house, but she, you know how they divide stuff up and they each pay for things? And she never thought he was going to die. She's at work one day. She gets a phone call that he is dead. She goes home only to find locked out of the house that the kids, he had been married before, and he had children, and you have no legal ties to anything. So she's without a place to live, without any resources, and had to go get an attorney because they don't think all the way through, because you don't know when something's going to happen. And if you don't have things legally put together and down, there's going to be some huge consequences. And the ones that I feel for with the way that we're doing services today in many instances is the grandkids. You know, they're real close to grandma and grandpa, and then they die the next minute they're gone. They go to the church service, and in the front is this little box, and they don't get it. And this one family told me about their 6-year-old the woman's daughter who was 6, the grandma had died. They had her cremated. She's sitting in her urn up front. And in the middle of the service, the 6-year-old turns to her mom and says, now I can see where they got grandma's head in there, but where's her arms and legs? You know what I mean? They have no idea what just took place. And so anyway, any other questions or comments? Did you learn anything new today? That's why I tell people it's always good to learn some new things, but then the downside is now you're held accountable for what you know. But believe me, it takes a little bit of work, like I said, to get things organized, to get it together, but it's really a very simple process. And then once you get your papers done and everything organized, pick a day, any day of the year, June 10th. Every June 10th, you fill out or you pull out your important papers and you look at them and you say, do they still say what I want them to say? Am I okay with what I have for a healthcare directive? Do I still want to be resuscitated this way? Has anything changed? Nope, everything's the same. And you're good for a whole nother year. Then the next year you pull it out. Oh, my husband died. I got to change beneficiaries. I got to do things. But It's the responsibility of knowing that we did what we could to take care of things and so that we don't leave a mess. And I see a lot of adult kids who end up being really angry at their parents because not only did they not know what their finances were or how to pay for a funeral, but they left a house full of stuff that they got to go through and get rid of. When my in-laws died, we had 3 of the largest dumpsters that the company owned. And I tried to get, my mother-in-law died first, and I tried to get my father-in-law to kind of go through some stuff earlier, but he just wouldn't do it. So I get it. But what a mess that was. And the family joke was, yeah, you can have anything that you want in here, but if you sit in a chair and it breaks, just remember it's either been screwed or glued, because they didn't throw anything away. So the message for all of us is let's get rid of our stuff. And guess what? Nobody takes U-Hauls to the cemetery. So all these things we think are so important, nobody takes them to the cemetery. So, well, thank you so much. If there's any other questions or anything else I can enlighten you on. And yes. Yeah, there's a new thing about green cemeteries now. And we have one sort of green cemetery. It's a ways here from the Twin Cities. And green meaning they don't even allow cremated remains. Some of them don't. So, because some green people feel that cremated remains are pollutants. But the pod is basically where you can put some cremated remains inside of a little dish inside of a tree, where the roots grow down and then they plant the tree. And some of them you can do in forests now where you buy a tree and it's planted in, Mary's name or something like that. There's a lot of things that you can do with cremated remains. I mean, they can be made into bullets and shot out of a gun. We have jewelry. You can go to the moon. I mean, lots of things. But again, you have to be careful. I had a really good friend who bought a lake cabin from a woman, and this woman told her, I'll give you a cheaper price if you promise to bury my cremated remains here. So my friend said, sure, I'll take $25,000 difference. So she planted the cremated remains, and she made a little cemetery over by the tree. And then when it came turn for her to sell the cabin, because they wanted to move to a bigger one, she said, I don't get it. My cabin just isn't selling, and it's prime, real estate and everything. And so I was up there, and I'm looking around, and I see this little makeshift cemetery over there. And I said, I know why it's not selling. You got to get rid of Mabel over here or do something different. Nobody wants to buy, where somebody's buried or a grave. Sure enough, she did something different, and the cabin sold right away. So, and a lot of people want to take the ashes and spread them in the backyard over the rose bushes. So that means on Memorial Day, your family, after the house is sold, is going to line up, to the new people who bought the house, and you're going to, look over the fence or what, so, but that one woman, I asked her, what are you going to do with your cremated remains? My husband is going to put them in a can of paint, and he's going to paint the bedroom ceiling. I had to chuckle at that one. I said, let's call a funeral director and see if you can actually do that. So he said, yes, you can, but it changes the consistency of the paint. It's kind of crumbly. But then it made me curious because one of our neighbors, their son died at home, and when they went to sell their house, they had to, by law, disclose that someone had died there. So I called the Minnesota Department of Realtors and I said, hey, if you've got cremated remains in the ceilings, do you have to disclose that that's there? How many say yes? You do, by law. So if you're thinking about that, you may want to change or disclose something different. But if you have any questions at all, yes.
If a person fulfilled what you educated us
Uh-huh.
and basically documented documented the answers to all these what to do questions, if all this was documented, is that what you talked about? Is on June 12th every year you pull out the documents and
Yep.
double check?
You could do that, and documents, I mean by those ones that you have drawn up by an attorney, a power of attorney, healthcare directive. You can create your own file, and you can go through and write a notebook and say, this is what I want, this is what I have. That's really a kind thing to do. You don't have to tell your kids where all your money is or how much you have, but at least tell them where the accounts are. Because it's really hard if you're not there to ask. We found even though my father-in-law was meticulous in naming all his assets, there was still a bunch that he forgot to put in there.
So if you had all that documented, and where do you file it? Where does it stay? You keep it in your kitchen cabinet, or what do you do with it?
You could create a file at your own home and say, this is where all my important documents are. I usually give a blue funeral file so that it's noticeable. So my funeral arrangements are in my blue file, or you could create your own. Now, if you created your own, that would be half the step because that would be there for your children. But then your children would have to take it into the funeral home or cremation society and explain to them. If you did some pre-planning, you could have both bases covered. You could have a home file, and you could have one at the funeral home.
So a way where all this pre-planning, all of that documentation, appropriate documentation, could be situated at a particular funeral home.
Anything pertaining to funeral. Funeral service has what we call a universal language. So when we fill out what we call a goods and services sheet, where we have to itemize every single item, here's one. I'll just send it through that you can kind of look at an estimate sheet of how much a funeral costs. Yes, you can write all that down, but when a funeral home does that, you could take that at any funeral home in the world and they would know what it is that you're talking about. Because it's a language that is taught for how processes go. But, you could say, I want cremation with a memorial service, but you don't know that you have to be in a container when you go into the crematory and you need to be in something when you come out. Do you want to have a simple cardboard box, or do you want to purchase a casket for you to go through the crematory in? Those are the things that you wouldn't know yourself. And like I said, it's a free service to go into any funeral home and have them do an estimate for you. So what your two choices are now is you can go into any funeral home, say I'm interested in doing some pre-planning, and they'll set up an appointment, and then you go in and they'll be able to give you an idea. So that's option one. Option two is you can come to an independent. There's only a couple of us that are considered independents. We do charge a one-time consulting fee, but we literally save you thousands of dollars. We know the prices for most of the funeral homes in the Twin Cities. We can tell you the difference of what it is that you're paying for, and we do the same thing of setting up a file. And you get a file, and then the funeral home gets a file, so one phone call that sets everything in motion at the time of death. Okay, is that it? I think we're right on time. Oh, we got 1 minute. My consultation fee is $100. And it doesn't matter how many times we meet. Sometimes we have to meet more than once because you want to talk to family, you want to figure it out. And I try to make it as convenient as possible. She said that we could meet, if people were interested in wanting to do it, we could meet in one of the rooms here. So you don't have to go into a funeral home. We can get that all set up. Or, again, you can go into any funeral home. No, you're good. You're good. Well, thank you, everybody. It's just been my privilege. And yeah, I hope that, we didn't, right quick, I forgot to introduce my props. What does a roll of toilet paper and a handful of leaves have to do with everything we talked about today? Give it your best shot. Anybody? Okay, I have come to the conclusion in life that we are either prepared or unprepared. Prepared meaning that you and I have the documents, we have the conversations, we have what we need, versus unprepared, which we don't. And this man stood up and he says, "What'd you do, stay up all night to think of that?" I said, "Well, I was just trying to come up with a visual." And he says, "All I can tell you is that unprepared is very messy." I said, "See, you just say it so well." All right. That is it. Thank you, thank you. If you need any extra sheets of these, if you have any friends or family that didn't get to come, please give them one. Let them start some conversations. We've got extras.